Hey everyone, welcome back to Here in Apologetics. Super pumped to join us today. Today I have Dr. Graham Oppy. We're going to be talking about defining religion and defining atheism. So, Dr. Oppy, thank you for joining me. How are you doing today?
It's a pleasure to be back, really.
I know I'm super pumped to talk to you again. And today it's getting close to evening here in America and Virginia, and you're just waking up in Australia. And yeah, I'm super pumped. So to start things off, do you want to talk a little bit about like who you are and what you do, and what got you interested in thinking about things like defining religion and defining atheism?
Okay, so I'm a philosopher at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. I've worked for the last, rather a long time now, at least the last 25 years, primarily in philosophy of religion. And one of the questions that invariably comes up, not so much, I think, in sort of the professional philosophy of religion, but in circles once you move outside the kind of professional philosophy of religion, is about the definition of terms like atheism and to a lesser extent religion.
Mhm. Yeah, it's super cool, and I think something that, like, when I first got introduced to this whole, like, worldview field was definitions were, controversial, especially with atheism. Like, it's very controversial, today. So, like, one initial, like, point of thinking about it is, like, why should we even care about defining religion and defining atheism? I think a lot of people are like, "Well, if you're an atheist, um, it's fine, whatever that means to you. You can define it in your own way," or same thing with, like, someone who's maybe religious. So why do you think we should care about defining religion and defining atheism in like a proper sense?
Okay, so I mean, I guess there's a couple of things to say here. I mean, it depends a bit what the purpose of doing the defining is. So in Anglo-American philosophy over the last 100 years or so, for a long time there was this kind of project of trying to define words that were in common use. So, can we say give necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge, or think about it this way: fill in the blank necessarily X knows that P if and only if, and then fill in the blank. Or you might try and do the same thing for causation or work of art and so on. And what emerged was that this is extraordinarily difficult. There are lots of people who are kind of skeptical that you can actually produce a definition of that kind that satisfies various conditions that you want a good definition to have. So it's not circular, it's not defining the more clear in terms of the less clear, and so on. And on the other hand, it survives counterexamples. So it really does pick out what it's supposed to pick out. And so that kind of project, I think, has become questionable. And if you're thinking about defining religion and atheism, it's important that it's not against that kind of background in order to satisfy that kind of analytical project. However, right, words like religion and atheism are, first of all, contested. So people actually have different ideas about what religion and atheism are. And second, along with this contestation, it's arguable also that there are quite a lot of different things that these words can mean in different contexts. That's particularly clear for religion. Maybe it's less clear for atheism. And so when people are getting together to discuss these topics, it's often useful for them to say how they understand what the word religion means or what the word atheism means, so that they can have a productive discussion and they don't end up talking past one another. And that's, even if even if I'm very clear about what I mean by atheism and you're very clear about what you mean by atheism, when we try to have a discussion about atheism, we might just kind of fail to engage because we aren't actually talking about quite the same thing.
Mm. So what do you think then, like, what should we do, like, to talk about the same thing? Like, when we're trying to find up, like, a proper definition, on defining, like, religion and atheism, what should it do?
Well, it might not be necessary for us to agree on a definition. It's more that if I know how you're using the term, I can understand what you're saying. And if you know how I'm using the term, you can understand what I'm saying. Of course, it would be easier for us if we agreed on the definition, because then we wouldn't have to keep doing this sort of translation in our heads. Oh, okay, so that's what he means, right?
Mhm.
It would be more straightforward. Um, there's a bunch of different things that you might think that you're going to do if you're giving a definition, even from your own point of view, right? Even if it's just for this kind of trying to avoid talking past each other project. So you might think that the important thing is to sort of identify the phenomena that you think are picked out by the term. So in certain circles, people talk about nominal definitions. What they've got in mind for a nominal definition is that, I'm defining religion, that my definition picks out all the things that are religion and doesn't pick out any of the things that are not religion. And perhaps it's not just that it does this for the actual world, but it does it for kind of other possible worlds as well. So that's one sort of way of thinking about a definition, where the kind of what matters is just the class of things that are being picked out. A different project that you might have, and in some circles this is called looking for a real definition, is to say something about what the essential intrinsic properties of whatever it is that we're talking about are. So that's quite different from picking the things out. The idea is that you've then got, you sort of know what the nature of the thing is, and that's what the definition is giving. There are lots of people who are skeptical about whether you can give real definitions, but there are some people who think you can. That's another thing that you might be doing. There's a third thing, at least for some concepts or some words, that you might think to do as well. And we'll come back, I think, and talk about this a bit more later. But you might think that you can give what's called in the literature an ameliorative definition. You might be able to give a definition that's kind of tailored to your political goals and ambitions. And in some circumstances, that might be a good thing to do. So it's not, the question isn't so much what do we mean by the word religion, but rather something more like, what should we mean given our kind of goals and purposes for of certain kinds, perhaps our activist purposes. So there's a bunch of different things that you might be doing in giving a definition, and it will kind of depend on the conversation that you're having, people that you're talking to, what kind of definition it's appropriate for you to give, I think.
So do you think then, like, can we have a definition that like exhaustively covers like what is and what isn't, maybe like a religion, or like covering like atheism? Because one of the things I thought about, I think you mentioned in the paper, is like you talk about Wittgenstein. He always talked about like the idea of like a game where there's like no like totally like exhaustive definition that we can use of a game, but we kind of have a sense of like what we know is a game, but what is not a game. Do you think like we could have something exhaustive with religion and atheism, or do you think it could be similar to that?
So I suspect that it's that if you're going back and thinking about the kind of necessary and sufficient conditions, it will be very hard to give a definition of religion in much the same kind of way that it's very hard to give a definition of game. And you might think that Wittgenstein was right about games, and you might think that that's just going to carry over to religion. On the other hand, there might, I mean, if you're thinking about this not in that way, but in terms of this is how I'm thinking about what they are, then you might be able to give something more precise, or for certain purposes, it might be useful just to make a stipulation. By religion, here and now, this is what I'm talking about. For example, if you're an anthropologist, you might think that there's a certain set of cultural practices that's what you want to be talking about when you're using the word religion. And you can just say maybe you can say what those practices are, and in that way give a definition that will be useful for your work as an anthropologist, but maybe not very useful when you're talking to somebody having an argument in the street about certain kinds of religious claims.
So maybe then at this point it'd be helpful to talk about like the controversies and like defining these things, because I think it's helpful to kind of look at that. So like, what's the controversy about defining religion? Like where's the debate in trying to understand like what is and what isn't like religion?
So in the academy, and across a range of different disciplines for at least 70 or 80 years, I would think, there's been this view that circulated that when Western scholars use the word religion or define the word religion, they end up privileging Western cultural practices over non-Western cultural practices. That and so what they end up doing is not really understanding cultural sort of other cultural practices, because they see them through the lens of their own cultural practices. So this is quite a big topic in religious studies, but also in areas like religious sociology and so on. And there are still quite a lot of people who advocate for not using the word religion at all when we're talking about about global cultural practices, or being very careful in crafting any kind of definition. So I think that's where the main debate about religion, at least in the academy, is located.
So do you think that like the worries that some people that maybe like from the West are too narrow in their definition of a religion, where the like Eastern, like I don't divide like West East, but like non-Western religions, like they may, like many people see them as religions, but like the Western religions may, or people like from the West may like not include them in their definition of religion.
Well, suppose you start off by saying that kind of what's central to religion is God, an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good being, right, who created the world. Well, that immediately rules out an enormous number of things that we ordinarily think of as religions, right? They turn out not to be religions after all. So that would be a terrible definition if you're taking seriously the idea that Taoism, Buddhism, the practices associated with the rainbow serpent and so on are all religions.
So I'm curious then, maybe like let's talk about atheism then. Like what's the controversy in defining atheism then, Dr. Oppy?
So I think this controversy is quite different. I think that at least in kind of North American philosophy of religion, there isn't really disagreement about the definition of atheism, or at any rate, there isn't much. Right, there's a lot of people who are kind of agreed on how to define that term and a bunch of other terms that go with it. So how to define theism, how to define agnosticism, and to the extent that people think about this, how to define innocence. On the other hand, outside of the academy, especially on the internet, there's an enormous range of debates, arguments, very intense arguments about the word atheism and its use. Now, how does that come about? I guess there's a couple of things. One thing is that although attitudes towards atheism vary, there are lots of people who would like to be able to call themselves atheists. And so, I mean, it's a kind of, for lots of people, the term has a negative valence, but for lots of people, it has a positive one. There's lots of people who would like to be able to call themselves atheists, right? So that's one part of it. And another part of it is that if you define atheism in certain kinds of ways, you might think that then gives you, I mean, I think this is a mistake, but you might think that it then gives you a certain kind of argumentative advantage, right? If you frame atheism in a certain kind of way, it means that atheism becomes the default position, or something that has to, that's very easy to argue for. I mean, I think a kind of analogy here that will work for some people is to think about presuppositionalism, right? I mean, lots of people who take up a presuppositionalist stance on the internet seem to think that it gives them a kind of almost impregnable argumentative advantage, right? And so similarly, if you think of atheism as just not having theistic beliefs, it's kind of hard to argue against that. Much harder to argue against that than it is to argue against the position that says there are no gods.
So you think what you're saying then, Dr. Oppy, is like if like a lot of people, maybe like the atheist side of things might have, and theists as well have gripes with presuppositionalists, because what they try to do is like put all the pressure on the person they're arguing against, saying like, hey, you have to do all this work, you have to show how you're doing all these things. And the atheist, maybe like the lack of belief atheist, might be trying to do like a similar thing, where putting the front on like the theist or someone else, say, hey, you have to prove this. All I'm doing is like negating a belief.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's part of what's going on. I mean, I think it's quite complicated, but
Mm-hmm.
yes, I mean, simplifying a bit. I think that there's a certain element of that. Yes.
No, there definitely is, like, even in the way, like if I've listened to interactions, where you have precepts and like how they may interact with people, and like maybe like negating beliefs, like there's similarities in how they like interact with like their interlocutors in like the certain like situations and whatnot. So yeah. So I'm wondering then, when we're talking about like the nature of definitions, one of the questions is, should the definitions require persuasiveness? Like, should they be persuasive to people? And should they require like maybe like a intellectual, like assent, like an atheist, like a definition of atheist must include someone that like is persuaded that there is no God, or something along these lines?
Right. So I'm thinking that definitions should not be loaded. And that's kind of part of the
Mm,
problem that we were thinking about before, about that kind of loading the definition so it makes it easier for you to argue, right?
yeah.
Or something like that. I don't think that you should necessarily, where you've got, so there's this old idea in philosophy, at least 50 or 60 years old, that some concepts are essentially contested, so that there's quite a lot at stake in how you think about, say, justice, for example. Um, what you shouldn't expect in a case like that, if you think that really people just operate with different conceptions of justice, you shouldn't expect that there's going to be a definition that's going to persuade everybody, oh, that's what we should mean by the term, right? And maybe it's all right if there are people using different conceptions of religion or different conceptions of atheism, if it turned out that there was a reason to think that those concepts were relevantly like justice, where there's kind of there's normative stuff at stake, and people just disagree about the normative stuff. So I don't think that you should expect to secure agreement, and I don't think that you should load your definitions in a way that favors you either. Right. So they're, I think, two aspects of the question that you are asking.
Hmm. Yeah, I like the idea of like not trying to like load definitions, because it's make it like very hard. So if you think of like something like religion, um, I think hopefully like the intent of like, if you define it, you want it to be like a very broad view, where you can encompass a bunch of different people from different beliefs. But then, like as you're talking about earlier, like if you limit it to like the idea of like an omnipotent, omnipresent, perfectly good God, like there's a lot of things that we would think of as religions, that you couldn't have be considered religion if that's your definition. So I think there's something really right about that, about not trying to load our definitions, because it's just going to lead to a lot of chaos, it seems like.
Right. I mean, even of course, if someone insists on doing that, um, you can say, okay, that's your that's how you're going to use the word. It's not how I'm going to use the word. When we're talking to each other, it's going to be more complicated now because
Hmm.
you have to remember what I mean. Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
So how should we go about like even like this discourse? Because I think for a lot of people, they might be like, "Hey, if you want to define religion that way, fine. Like, who cares?" Or like, "You want to define atheism that way, fine. Who cares?" Like how do we make progress in like this dialogue? And like what should we be aiming towards in defining these things?
So, um, as I said, in some ways, it doesn't matter if we use the terms differently. It just makes conversations harder. But it's good if we can reach agreement on the use of terms, just because it makes things easier. And so, I think that the kind of practice that you get in, say, in North American philosophy of religion, with respect to terms like theism and atheism, is going to be pretty good, right? There's pretty widespread agreement, not total agreement, but widespread agreement. If we're using the word theism, that we mean something like there's at least one God. If we're using the word atheism, we mean something like there's no gods. If we're using the word agnosticism, we mean suspension of judgment between those two positions. If we're using the word innocent, we mean somebody who's just never thought about it, never entertained the thought or considered the question the proposition whether there are gods.
Mm-hmm.
And then that just kind of works well as a framework for discussion in philosophy of religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is super helpful to have like a definition that a lot of people can agree upon, because it's easy to have this conversation. So my next question for you then is like, what are, I don't even know how to say this word that's on my question sheet. I'm trying to think of what I was thinking of. Like, what are ameliorative definitions? I'm trying to think of the exact word here.
Okay, so I guess the term was introduced into philosophy in about the year 2000 by Sally Haslinger in a paper that she wrote about race and gender. And she was thinking about words like man and woman, black and white. And she was thinking there that maybe for certain kind of political purposes, it might be useful to define those words for the political purposes. In ways that are connected to your ultimate political goals. So she proposes, for example, there that you might think. So actually, I will read out the definition that she gives so that I don't get it wrong. That you might think of woman as someone who's regularly and for the most part observed or imagined to have certain features presumed to be evidence of biological role in reproduction, something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then what's added to that, and that in virtue of that, they are taken to have negative standing of certain kind, right? They're thought because of that, they're oppressed in various ways or whatever. Right. Now, that's not being put forward as a definition that it's imagined everybody is going to agree to. It's rather that it's a definition that might be very useful when you're thinking about what the kind of goals of a feminist organization are. So that's, and what I thought in the paper was that you could imagine that at certain times in history, it might have been useful for atheist activists to have kind of ameliorative definitions of atheism or of religion, so being non-religious, that are framed in similar terms. So maybe, for example, to be non-religious is kind of being regularly and for the most part observed or imagined to have certain features presumed to be evidence of negative standing on the path to salvation or something like that. And maybe that would work. And this is kind of hypothetical because I don't imagine that for people in the 21st century in the West that there's going to be much use for ameliorative definitions of atheism and religion. But, you know, in the 18th century in France or the UK, it might have been quite a different manner.
Mm-hmm. So, like, if we were to use like ameliorative definitions, like if we were going to use them today to like structure like how we define like religion and atheism, how do we do it? Because I'm trying to get my mind around exactly like what the implications of this is.
So I don't think that you would propose this as a definition that you would use to try to structure an academic discipline, for example, because it's contentious, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
the idea is that it's a definition that suits the purposes of certain kinds of activists.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. So I'm curious then, maybe the next thing to talk about, Dr. Oppy, is like looking at like how things are defined outside of the West. I remember we talked about this like in one of the previous conversations you did. One of the things you talked about is like philosophy of religion is very like Western centered, where it doesn't look a lot at like Eastern religions, or like you talked about like the original religion of like the native people of Australia. So like when we're looking at religion and atheism, how do these definitions are they going to differ outside of the West? Like if you talk to someone in the Eastern world, would they have a different view on what these things mean?
So I think that's a good question. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's maybe it looks different depending upon whether we're looking at countries where there's widespread use of English versus where there's not, because there's kind of questions about translation, whether there are words in other languages that correspond very closely to our words religion and atheism. So the particular case that I discuss is India, and that is in the paper. The particular case I discuss is an example from India, and it's amongst English-speaking people who are actually writing and publishing in English. So that kind of narrows down the scope a bit. I think that it's quite hard to tell whether there are really important differences between the way that the English speakers in India and English speakers in the United States use the words atheism and religion. The particular paper that I looked at was one which was trying to argue that atheism is understood rather differently by Indian scientists than it is by scientists and philosophers of religion in the West. So there's a paper by Thomas called Atheism and Unbelief Among Indian Scientists. And he wanted to argue that there are these really radical differences between scientists in India who call themselves very strong atheists, and then certain people in the West who call themselves strong atheists. And what he pointed to in the paper was that there are all these ways in which these Indian scientists who insist that they're hardcore atheists still participate in various Indian cultural traditions that are kind of embedded in Indian religions. In particular, he was looking at Hindus, so embedded in the Hindu religion. So these people will still observe festivals, give their children names that ultimately can be traced back probably to the Vedas, a whole lot of things like that. And he says, and this is radically different from people in the West who just, the kind of hardcore atheists in the West just don't do those sorts of things. And he points to Richard Dawkins as an example. And I think that he's just wrong about that. I mean, Dawkins himself actually has children with names that are derived from Christian tradition, observes Christmas in the way that lots of non-believers do. It's still kind of family time and so on. And it seemed to me that actually, if there are differences here, they're much more subtle and harder to detect than Thomas imagines. There may well be differences, important differences, but it would take something more than kind of casual observation of people in the West in order to determine what they are. And I think that there are quite formidable difficulties to doing this because although we have various kind of global survey instruments that are meant to provide us with data about believers and non-believers, I think that those survey instruments are all very poorly designed. They tend to lump non-religious people into a single category and don't distinguish between people who have quite firm beliefs and people who kind of flip-flop. Doesn't really properly distinguish between people who are, I'll say, agnostic and people who are committed to non-belief. And so we actually just don't have data. We don't have data with respect to particular countries like India, and we don't have kind of global data that would help to answer the question. So I just think it's an open question whether there are significant differences or not, despite the fact that there are some people who've been writing papers trying to point to where the significant differences might lie. I think it's kind of premature at this stage to draw any conclusions.
So I think an interesting point here to turn to now is like in your mind, like properly like defining these things. So maybe starting with like religion, Dr. Oppy, how would what do you think is like a proper definition of like what religion is?
So a definition that I use in my work would be probably a better place to start here. So someone else that I quite admire, an anthropologist, Scott Atran, wrote a book back in the very early 2000s called In Gods We Trust. And in that work, he puts forward what he says is a stipulative definition of the word religion that picks out the phenomena that he wants to talk about as an anthropologist doing kind of cross-cultural study of various kinds of cultural practices, which he's quite happy to call religious practices. And I think, although his definition, I think, is kind of narrower than the one that I would want to complicate his definition in certain ways, it seems to me that his definition is sort of a really useful one to work with, and that philosophers of religion would do well to think about Atrin's definition and possibly adopt it for themselves. And so that's something that I've suggested in various places, in various of my writings in the last 5 or 6 years.
Mm-hmm. What exactly is his definition?
Okay, do you really want me to read it out? It's very complicated.
We got time.
Yeah. Okay. So I wrote it down because there's no way I'm going to remember it. I mean, I could describe it roughly, but it's better if I give it to you. So this isn't exactly his definition. I've modified it slightly because I wanted it to be clear that the definition would extend to cover religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So religions are passionate communal displays of costly commitments to the satisfaction of non-natural beings and or the overcoming of non-natural regulative structures. So for the first bit, the non-natural beings think gods. For the non-natural regulative structures, think sort of cycle of reincarnation, rebirth, and karmic score, that kind of stuff. Resulting from evolutionary canalization and convergence of the following four things: widespread belief in non-natural agents and or non-natural regulative causal structures. Second, hard to fake expressions of costly material commitments, which might be money, time, effort, and so on, to the satisfaction of those non-natural agents and or the overcoming of those non-natural causal structures. Three, mastery of people's existential anxieties, think fear of death, worries about loneliness, so on. So mastery of people's existential anxieties by those costly commitments. And four, ritualized rhythmic sensory coordination of the things just mentioned in communion, congregation, and intimate fellowship. Right, now that definition has a lot of elements to it, and the elements that it picks out you find across the globe in cultural practices. And I mean, it's clear enough how you can see things like Christianity and Islam and Judaism fitting this definition, but also you can see how things like Taoism and Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, and the indigenous practices in Australia with respect to the rainbow serpent and so on, how they all fit. Right? So that's why that it seems to me that it's kind of useful to think about religion in these terms.
So do you think, like, because I'm thinking about this definition, I'm like, wow, there's a lot of different things here. Like, there's a lot. I was just like trying to write down main
Yeah.
points I was going. Do you think that like there's any way to like maybe like this make this more like compact, or like when we're defining religion, like is it just like so complicated that like we're just gonna have to give a pretty large definition or broad definition?
So I think that if you're going to succeed in defining anything, it's going to end up being quite complicated, right? I mean, just think back to the efforts to define game or justice or whatever. No simple definitions work. I think we can be quite confident of that. But it seems plausible to me that religion is a kind of complex phenomenon. If the kind of skeptics are wrong, and there is a kind of global phenomenon that it makes sense to call religion, it will have something like the structure and features that Patron is pointing to, I think. I know I should emphasize he doesn't say that this is that this is anything more than stipulation. I mean, he just stipulates this is what I'm going to mean by religion for my purposes because it picks out the phenomena I want to discuss. It's my idea that maybe you can think of it as something more than stipulation, that you can think of it as actually a kind of useful contender for here's an idea of religion that would serve various kinds of purposes, especially academic purposes, quite well.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, and I think that I don't know. I feel like religion might be a little bit trickier to define than atheism because I think that religion is getting a lot more like specific. Maybe we'll get to that when we talk to like atheism because I think with atheism, like you have atheism versus theism, and like there's kind of like the two views you could have. But then once you get to like religion, like this is a subset of like theism. So like with these definitions we're giving religion, like you could be a theist and not be religious is kind of what we're still like this definition leaves that open that door, right?
Yeah, that's right. Um, and one of the criticisms of very early attempts, like in the 19th century, some European theists more or less tried to define religion in terms of belief in gods, right? That
Mm-hmm.
was the right, and you can see why, or even worse, belief in God, right? You can see why that looks very narrow from a kind of proper survey of cultural practices around the globe, where God doesn't feature, and perhaps even gods don't feature. I mean, if you think about ancestor worship, for example, it's not clear that we should think of the ancestors as gods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that's like when you get to your definition, like say you were like had commitments in some sense to like venerating your ancestors or something like that. And like you were gonna say like something like that, and there's gonna be this like ritual, but like you still like if you didn't believe in like these non-natural beings, then you it wouldn't be a religion, it'd just be like kind of like something you do, which would be like similar than maybe talking about like these holidays. Like if you can like you can observe like Christmas and still not be like actually like have that belief that like in God's like or a God in that kind of belief.
Right. So, I mean, this is interesting too, because there are questions about the extent to which belief really matters is
Mhm.
really kind of central. So in some sense, if you grow up as a kind of practicing Hindu or Buddhist, you're going to think that there is reincarnation and there's the karmic wheel and there's this kind of goal of liberation, maybe, right? But the belief's not that important. It's the practices. It's the way you live that matters. Whereas in Christianity, believing has a really central role because it's central to salvation, right?
Mhm.
Um, so the even thinking of the emphasis being placed on belief tends to kind of skew the um, the view that you've got about the phenomena, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. So maybe then, like, let's talk about. So we talked about defining religion. Like, how do we define atheism then? Like, in your view, Dr. Hoppy, like, how do you define atheism?
So I kind of went over this before, but so I, in various places, I've said, look, what we want to do is we want to have a sort of coordinated definition of a bunch of things. It's not like we just want to define the word atheism without thinking about how we're going to define theism,
Mhm.
agnosticism, innocence, and so on. Uh, and this is because, sort of quite generally in the background, there's this thought that, I mean, let's suppose that we can talk about propositions for a minute. There's a at a kind of coarse-grained level, there's only a small number of types of relationships that you can have to a proposition. You can believe it, you can believe its negation, you can suspend judgment about it, or you can just have never considered it, right? And we can take that schema and we can apply it to the claim that there's at least one God. And that gives you kind of good candidates for the definitions for theism, atheism, agnosticism, and innocence, right? The atheist thinks there are no gods. The theist thinks there's at least one God, and the monotheist thinks there's exactly one God, God with a capital G. Agnostics are just undecided which way to go, and innocents have never thought about it. So, very young children, perhaps people who've grown up in cultures where this idea just doesn't circulate, and so on.
Mhm. So would you categorize like young children and like people like that as like agnostics? Like what
No,
exactly?
they'll definitely be characterized as innocents if they're
Okay.
young enough, right? Because
Mhm.
at a certain point, you don't even have the concept of God or a God, so you can't entertain the proposition that there are gods or that there's at least one God, and so you come out as innocent. And likewise, I'm assuming that, for example, dogs will come out as innocents, right?
Mhm.
They just can't form the thought.
So we can avoid this idea of like saying that like rocks are dogs or like babies are atheists or agnostics or things like this, because we have this like
Yeah,
category of innocence.
that's what this category is doing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, historically, there have been, people who want to say things like we're all born atheists or we're all born agnostics. And that's not right. We're all born innocents, I think.
Yeah. So we're born innocents, and then we kind of look at and based on how we're exposed to these things growing up, we kind of form like our background beliefs and form these beliefs on like whether we believe in God or we just don't know, or there is no God. And that's kind of starts the formation of like, well, who we'd be.
So if you grow up in a culture where the notion of God or gods is important to your cultural practices, and as I said before, maybe that's not true universally, globally. Maybe there are places where, for long periods of time, no one ever had the concept of a God or God with a capital G, and so they just remain innocents forever. But in Western countries, it's kind of hard to reach adulthood without, at some point, coming to um, hear the word God and have some understanding of what it means or
Mm-hmm.
might mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm wondering then, like in your view, Dr. Oppy, what do you think the problem is? We talked about this a little bit earlier, but what's the problem with just defining atheism as like a lack of belief? I'm not going into like the ideas like so. Like, if you want to say atheism is like the belief that God does not exist, what's the problem with just trying to say like, hey, atheism is just like my absence of belief or something like
Yeah.
that?
So suppose, I mean, one thing that's going to happen if you go that way is you're not distinguishing between those people who um, fail to believe in God because they don't even have the concept of God, people who fail to believe in God because they're actually suspending judgment between believing and not believing, and people who actually don't believe. Right. And those are categories that you want to be able to separate because there's different things to say about them. If one of the kind of oddities here is if you really said, look, I'm going to define um, atheism as not having the belief that there's at least one God, then just by symmetry, it will be plausible to define theism as not having the belief that there are no gods. Right? And
Mm-hmm.
then it would turn out that there are people who are both theists and atheists, namely the people who suspend judgment. And that
Mm-hmm.
that seems to not fit very well with the way that we ordinarily use these words, right? So it's sort of it's not the if you kind of zoom in, it's hard to see why you might think that it was problematic to if all you're focusing on is, I lack the belief, and that's what makes me an atheist. But when you zoom out and you think about the wider picture and you think about connections to other terms that we use, I think it looks much less comfortable. I mean, maybe it's just it kind of offends the theorist in me, but I would much prefer to have the fourfold classification that I've suggested. I think it does less violence to the way that we use all of these words
Mm-hmm.
together.
Yeah, I think it helps make it more clear to you on like what exactly someone may be. So I think it's helpful. So if atheism is just if someone's gonna say like, hey, I'm an atheist, I just lack a belief in God. I'm not saying there is no God. I don't believe in God. So they could end up like being if we want to be like give like if theism is the opposite of that, and we give theism a fair treatment, they might be an atheist, but they also might be a theist at the same exact time. If we're gonna have like a lack of belief that there are zero gods, is that kind of where we're headed
Yeah,
down with that route?
yeah, yeah. So that was the idea, right? I mean, it seems much more sensible to say that somebody who's undecided is in a very different category from someone who says um, there definitely isn't, and is also in a different category from somebody who's never thought about it, has never actually entertained the concept. Right? Those are three very different kinds of attitudes, and it's not particularly useful to collect the three of them together under the one heading. And I think, as you just said, right, you can illustrate how unhelpful that is by thinking about the corresponding definition for theism,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't think anybody would want to adopt. right? I don't think there are any theists who would want to adopt that definition of theism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like a strange definition to say the least. Anything else, Dr. Oppy, you want to talk about here before we start to wrap up?
I don't think so. I mean, I think this topic, the various questions about the definition of religion, the definition of atheism, so the definition of those two words, throws up lots of kind of hard and interesting questions. But as I said at the beginning, it's not clear how significant these questions are
Mm-hmm.
at the level of kind of two people talking to one another. So long as you can manage a conversation perfectly well with somebody who wants to insist that atheism is lack of belief, so long as you know that that's what they think, and so long as they know that that's not what you think, that you use the word, and you can just go on using your words as you ordinarily will, or you can say, okay, given that there's this difference, let's not use those words.
Mm-hmm.
Let's avoid them, right? Because this is the other thing. We could carry on our conversation at the level of there's this proposition, right? There are no gods. What's your attitude towards that proposition, right? Are you agnostic about it? Do you believe it? Do you believe it's negation, right? And now we kind of, but just not use the word atheism at any point. Now we can have the substantive discussion about whatever it is. If it turns out that the person thinks only that they're suspending judgment, then that's fine. We can have an argument then about whether they really should be suspending judgment or not.
Mm.
And
Yeah,
if
I
on
think
the
that's
other hand it turns out that they really believe that there are no gods, that's really their position, then we can have a discussion about that too.
I like the idea of kind of like bringing forth these propositions because I think it really helps, especially like when you're a deadlock of like, hey, let's just say like there are no gods. How do you feel about that proposition? Are you for it? Are you against it? Are you not sure? Really helps like further dialogue. So yeah, I think that's great. So thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate this conversation. And anything else you want to say about like how people can connect with you or follow you in your work or things like that?
I'm not really. I guess as far as the things that we've been talking about today go, apart from the paper, the place where I've probably given the most discussion of this is in my little elements book for Cambridge that's called Atheism and Agnosticism. So the first part of that is a slightly more elaborate discussion of the things that we've been talking about today. So if people wanted to follow up, that would be a place to go. The element's quite small. It's a like 30,000 word book. And I don't think it's as difficult as things like arguing about gods. So, and I hope that that first chapter where I'm talking about what atheism and agnosticism are is reasonably accessible. So that's the only thing I'll say.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Graham Oppy. I really appreciate it. It's always so fun to talk with you, and I really appreciate this conversation. Yeah, thanks for coming on, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. Hope you found this conversation valuable. And yeah, if you're new here, always encourage you to subscribe, leave a like, all that fun stuff, and that's it. We'll see you next time. Dr. Oppy, thank you so much again one last time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, bye everyone. Have